It's 7 after 10 o'clock. Welcome to the second hour of the Talking Point. I did promise that today was a special broadcast. We're coming to you live from the Leonardo Hotel in Sandton. Of course, we are in partnership with Standard Bank Insurance and the Mail and Guardian's Thought Leadership Series. And today we're really turning the spotlight onto the issue of climate change. I am joined by an incredible panel of experts that are really going to help contextualize what the climate change problem that we are facing as a society is and bring it back home to how we as South Africans are really impacted by it, and what are the measures we need to put in place to better protect ourselves going into the future. I suppose it really is about building resilience into the system in many ways to mitigate against the future effects. We are in a room that is full of an audience. Everybody seems to be on their best behavior today. I hope that you're going to relax a little bit more because it's part of the conversation. So later on in this hour, I'll also be giving you an opportunity to ask our panelists some questions and also share some of the insights that you have, because I know that we've got some really senior industry experts in the insurance sector. Before we go any further, let me perhaps begin by setting the context for why we're having this conversation in the first place. It's something that many South Africans would know by now. You look at a province like KZN, over the last 4 years, we have seen very extreme weather patterns in that province. In fact, it looks like every time there is some kind of path to recovery, there's a setback because the floods have been ongoing and we've all watched the impact. Hundreds of people losing their homes just after one climate incident. And it takes years and years to be able to rebuild those houses, to rebuild the bulk infrastructure that is affected. It's not just the issue of floods. We're also seeing severe weather patterns in terms of drought, water shortages. We're having more and more cyclones within the SADC area. And so all of this paints the backdrop for why this conversation is necessary. On the panel today, I'm joined by Johan van Greuning, who is the CEO of Standard Bank Insurance Limited. Johan, good morning to you. Thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you. Delighted to be here with you today.
Also part of our panel this morning, Dr. Dora Marema is Portfolio Head, Municipality Sustainability with the South African Local Government Association, SALGA. Good morning, Dora.
Good morning. Just to qualify that I'm not a doctor, actually. So my initials are DR, so that's why.
Oh, okay. I can understand why it's important for you to clarify.
Carry on.
Yeah, you don't want to be called a doctor and end up, caught up in all sorts of controversy. Thank you so much for that, Dora Marema. And also part of our conversation this morning is Dr. Andries Kruger, who's a chief scientist at the South African Weather Service, University of Stellenbosch. Dr. Kruger, good morning.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm from the South African Weather Service, and I'm actually affiliated to the University of Pretoria.
All right, I'm just going to ask that we check Dr. Kruger's mic, please, so that it's positioned correctly. I don't want problems when we get to him and what he has to contribute to this conversation. So, Johan, perhaps let me kick it off with you and give you an opportunity to really set the context for us. Of course, we've got lots of potential as a country, as a continent, but we also know that we are the ones that are worst affected by adverse weather events and weather climate, and the resilience in our economies is not quite there yet. So when you think about the future and how we need to be building differently, what are some of the things that immediately come to mind?
Thanks for that question. I think it's important that from a Standard Bank perspective, Africa is considered as one of the biggest growth opportunities on the continent. And I think the key drivers for that is important to understand, and let's start off with that. Africa is the youngest and the fastest growing economy. It is estimated that it holds approximately 65% of the world's remaining uncultivated arable land. And Africa's got vast renewable energy potential and an abundance of minerals remaining or available that is critical for energy transition. So by 2030, it's therefore estimated that Africa will have a larger working age population compared to India and China, with a majority of the population below the age of 25. And it's these factors that really present the immense opportunity for economic growth. I think if we then just think of the reason for the conversation today is what threatens this growth, and it's really, so there are many challenges that are well documented that can impact this growth, but not least climate change is one of the major points. I think, as many of you know, that the main reason or the impacts that is as a result of climate change is rising temperatures and sea levels, the changing rainfall patterns, and then just the frequency of extreme weather events such as droughts and floods. And it's these severe consequences that affect a vast range of sectors. These include agriculture, energy, and infrastructure. And it's these weather conditions that threat the economic situation of households, businesses around the world, and albeit in different ways.
All right. Thanks for that context, Johan. Professor Kruger, let me come to you. You know, often the conversation that we seem to have a lot when we see adverse weather events is, and experts say, no, these are signs of climate change. Others say, but what exactly is climate change? How do we know that it is climate change, and it's not just weather patterns that repeat themselves after a set period within the environment?
Okay, to give an elementary explanation of climate change is that since the Industrial Revolution, the industrialization of the world, there has been an unabated release of greenhouse gases, mainly carbon dioxide. And the features of a greenhouse gas is that it is able to absorb heat, keep heat, and stay in the atmosphere for a very long time. So since then, there's been a vast amount of greenhouse gases released into the atmosphere. And what one must understand about the greenhouse gas is actually, in modest quantities, greenhouse gases is actually good for the atmosphere and for human life, because it keeps the temperature at habitable levels at about 15 degrees Celsius. But if you are going to increase the greenhouse gases to, since then up to now it is by about, I would say 30%, then obviously something is going to change. And the change that we see that's the most obvious is a warming of the atmosphere. And for the few skeptics that remained about climate change, I think last year was an eye-opener, where it was the hottest year in the instrumental record, and it was the hottest by quite a wide margin. So climate change is a reality. How you can verify that is by looking at weather observations, and you can also look at it by simulating the climate through climate models. And if you put in the increased greenhouse gases into the climate models, it tallies very well with what you observe. So we are quite confident, we are very confident, that the release of greenhouse gases is the main cause of the climate change that we are experiencing today.
What is the impact of this that we are seeing more broadly on the continent, and if you can bring it closer to home?
Okay, because this conversation is basically more about extreme rainfall, I will try to explain it. There are two main elements that one must consider. And the first is that global warming is not uniform across the globe. For example, last year was the hottest year on record globally, but not for South Africa. South Africa was about the 8th hottest year in the instrumental period, where the years 2015, 2016, 2019, that were actually our hottest years that we experienced. And this differential warming causes a change in the atmospheric circulation patterns. Now, what I mean by that is that you have certain kind of weather systems that produce more rainfall and others that produce less rainfall, for example, high pressure systems. And if the average size and the position of those systems change over time, then you will have some regions experiencing more rainfall and other regions experiencing less rainfall. The other thing that one must take into account is that in a warming atmosphere, warmer air is able to absorb more moisture. And that means that there are more moisture now in the atmosphere than it used to be, like, for example, 100 years ago. And this increase in moisture is actually, you can say it is making the rainfall cycle more extreme. In other words, there are more evaporation, more convection, and more rainfall that falls into a certain event. So what we have found when we analyzed our data of the past 100 years is that when it rains more. And obviously that will mean that you will have an increase in the likelihood of flash floods that we've seen recently from our observations.
The issue of the impact is not just something that is felt by businesses, Dora, it's also felt by individuals. And I suppose this is where you as SALGA really come in, because it speaks to the ability of the infrastructure and the capability of the infrastructure to take on that additional pressure. Unfortunately, what we've seen in our municipalities, if Professor Kruger is talking about flash floods, our stormwater drains often are incapacitated to deal with it. Speak to me about the vulnerabilities that you believe our society more generally at a local government level is then exposed to as a result of these changes.
So much. Thank you so much, Kathy, for this question. I think the impacts of climate change are really felt very much at the local level. Communities are not able to shoulder the amount of destruction that they have to suffer. Many people, really lose their livelihoods. So when, for example, you've got a flash flood and roads are destroyed, telecommunication infrastructure, electricity infrastructure is all uprooted. A lot of communities are cut off. I think many of us have seen how children are not able to go to school or have to swim in big rivers to be able to cross on the other side. Sick people are not able to go and get to the clinics to get their medication, and people can't get to work. And that affects the infrastructure in the municipality. The local economy, small businesses lose their livelihoods and their businesses. But again, I think most importantly, communities are uprooted. It's not only the loss of life. Those who remain behind then have to be forced to stay in public halls or stay with other relatives. And sometimes it takes quite a long time for help to be able to arrive, because it is a coordinated thing that has to happen afterwards. Farmers lose their crops. They are not able to, they don't have insurance like other sectors of society to be able to shoulder the amount of loss. When you've got a drought, farmers or small-scale farmers or subsistence farmers also lose their crops, and they are not able. So we've also seen, as a result of this warmer, hotter climate, that there's an infiltration of pests that then attacks their crops. But again, there's opportunistic health breaks that then happen after a disaster, for example. And I think when you look at all of that, it really compounds an already vulnerable infrastructure at a local level that just creates a crisis when a small municipality that has to respond to something like that.
The question that, of course, many people will ask with the picture that is being painted is, what can I do? Because we don't really want to leave our lives to the elements. What can we do practically to better protect ourselves against the effect of global change, climate change? And Johan, often, we had that hailstorm in Johannesburg last year. People's cars were dented, so many of them on social media. We saw driveways of complexes seemingly collapsing as a result of those flash floods. I'm sure your phone lines are one of those that were ringing off the hook, people wanting to cash in their claims, right? But really, what is it that we can do to better protect ourselves?
Thank you. And indeed, these events lead to a significant influx of claims when these events happen. I think the most important, the insurance is just one of the role players that provide the financial aid to speed up the recovery. But there are aspects, so of late you would have seen several announcements and weather warnings that are issued. And these all help individuals to plan better. If you see, there's often warnings to alert individuals to avoid certain low-lying areas when they travel, or when you see that hail is forecasted, it just takes that little bit of planning to say, maybe I stay or I travel later, because you can quite effectively avert being impacted by that. Now, that's easier said than done, but every small step in taking preventative measures can help to reduce the impact. So insurance will always just provide that buffer, but sadly a large percentage of people remain uninsured, and what we've seen is in some events only about 20% of people in communities actually have access to insurance.
Are you finding that as an industry you're having to adapt to the changing weather patterns as well, in terms of what you have as your terms and conditions within the overall package you're offering to customers?
So I believe one of the most important roles that we play is one of education, because it's not just the insurance standalone that can reduce the impact. So it's the extent to which the consumer starts adopting some of the risk mitigating measures, because it's a collective effort from everybody.
Professor Kruger, what is it that we can be doing to better protect ourselves from these effects? If you have already built your brick house and you've already used certain materials that perhaps are considered not as resilient to flooding as others?
I think such an issue must be looked at from a disaster management perspective. And there are three components to it that one must take into consideration. And that is, what is the hazard? In other words, the size of or the magnitude of the rainstorm or event that happened. What is the vulnerability of the community? And also, what is the capacity to deal with it? And there are many role players that must come to the party, to solve this problem. We can say, for example, from the weather service side, okay, this is the hazard that we think that's going to occur, and it will be so much rainfall in a small space of time. And then we come to, okay, now the community is vulnerable. How vulnerable is the community? Is the community more affluent in that they have housing that is fulfilling the building standards and so on, or is it more informal settlements? Is it situated in floodplains and stuff like that? And then also, you have to have an increase in capacity to deal with these problems. And with that, I mean is effective communication to the communities, as well as a better working relationship between local government, for example, the Weather Service, the National Disaster Management Council. All those bodies must integrate what they are doing to make the response more efficient.
One of the things that we've seen, and as I'm seeing the pictures that are being projected on the screen, these are pictures from some of the floods that we've experienced in the country over the last sort of 24 months. But what often happens, Professor Kruger, is that people look at floods in an area and they say, well, these houses should have never been built here in the first place. And sometimes it's not just informal settlements, but it's suburbs that have been built, and experts like yourselves will say, well, they've been built along the flood line because the 100-year flood line came up to X mark, and yet, you know, you've got this beautiful double-story house that's there, and it's now collapsed.
Yes, that is why it's so important to adhere to municipal regulations and building regulations. And for vulnerable communities, sometimes they do not have a choice, you know, where to build their settlements and so on, because they want, for example, be close to work because of transport costs, whatever. So there is a, from my perspective, you know, I'm a climatologist, I'm not a town planner, but I would say, you know, that those things should be considered, you know, going forward.
Do you think that they are being considered to the extent that they should be?
Well, from what we've seen, you know, the disasters that we get, that we are observing, and the impacts of the disasters, that is, from where I'm sitting, it's not the case, you know, because if you think about the Durban floods, there's a very nice article written in, published in the Water Wheel magazine. It was authored by Professor Schulze from UKZN, and we argued, because he's got, he is very knowledgeable in the rainfall climate of KwaZulu-Natal, where he said that most of the rainfall that actually occurred was not unprecedented, apart from certain small pockets, and the impacts were not as severe as what used to happen in previous incidents of that nature. And if you look deeper into why the impacts were so severe, it's got to do with informal settlements, not proper town planning, alien vegetation, a removal of vegetation in some instances. So all those things, it's an interdisciplinary thing, you know, that must, engagements that must happen to solve these problems.
All right. Thanks for that, Professor Kruger. So in a moment, I guess then I'll have to give Dora the floor to respond then on the issue of what is happening at a local level that is enabling some of the issues that Andries has raised. It's 10:30. It's time for the latest news headlines. All right, we continue the conversation on the Talking Point. It is a special broadcast in partnership with Standard Bank Insurance and the Mail and Guardian. It's a thought leadership series, and today we're specifically focusing on the impact of climate change. How is the world changing, and how does society, I suppose, public-private partnerships respond to it, and most importantly, also the insurance sector and industry, how can it be adapting to what is this changing climate? Joining us for this conversation is a panel of guests, some of which I've introduced earlier, but for the benefit of those that are just joining the conversation, I'm joined by Johan van Greuning. He's the CEO of Standard Insurance Limited. It's a short-term insurance arm of the Standard Bank Group. Dr. Andries Kruger, Chief Scientist at the South African Weather Service, University of Stellenbosch, and Ms. Dora Marema, who is a portfolio head, municipal sustainability with the South African Local Government Association, that is SALGA. So, and in a moment then, I'm also going to be giving our guests in the room an opportunity to engage with our panelists and ask whatever questions may be on your mind. I'm going to ask that when we get the opportunity to do that, please, if you can just introduce yourself, which organization you represent, and also which panelist in particular you're directing your questions to. We are live on radio. That is not to add pressure, but it's just so that you can be mindful of the time. If we can keep some of those questions as brief as possible, it will also be helpful. So, Dora, I want to give you an opportunity to respond to the issues that Andries were raising, because it does seem that a lot of the capacity and the capability that is needed to safeguard communities when it comes to climate change also rests within the local sphere of government. And adherence to municipal regulations is a big one. Proper town planning is an issue that has come up as well.
No, definitely. I think the challenge of climate change is a big one, and it requires structural change, which must happen at an enormous scale and at a very fast speed. So we no longer cannot afford incremental adaptation measures, for example, because you can see that the frequency of these disasters has just really increased. So what we need is multi-sectoral, multidisciplinary public-private partnerships. I mean, there are already some examples. Because we know that the private sector has got the skills, has got the experience, has got access to resources. And I think it is important we started to have a conversation within SALGA to look at innovative public-private partnerships, moving away from business as usual where local government would look at the private sector as a service provider, but actually looking at partnerships that would start looking at sharing the risk 50-50 to rebuild the infrastructure. And I understand what Professor Kruger is saying in terms of, Dr. Kruger is saying in terms of adherence to municipal regulations. What we also need is the transformation of the education sector. How we are producing, how we are equipping our planners, our architects. Because if you look at what traditionally would be a 100-year flood, I believe that, I mean, I just don't have the science, but I believe that it has probably started to kind of backtrack. It's now 50 years or even 10 years. And what does that mean for our professionalization of these sectors? So we need almost like a reskilling, re-education of those that are in the system, that are in the municipalities, having to approve these plans that are presented to them. But again, the new ones that are coming on board. We need to be thinking about innovation, the 4IR, designing early warnings. We need to be looking at the partnership that will assist to reduce the risk, because right now we are concentrating on responding. We need to be moving one step ahead and actually say, given the projections of what the IPC is telling us, what are some of the interventions that we can be able to partner to reduce the risk, to reduce the likelihood of loss of life and destruction on infrastructure?
One of the biggest issues has been, Dora, that there's not been a strong enough enforcement of regulation. And that is part of why we end up seeing informal settlements crop up in the way that they do, but also formal settlements crop up in the way that they do. And that rests with municipalities. Now, if there is an inability to actually enforce what is in legislation, in the context of a public-private partnership, where do you see the role of the private sector coming in there, where they really, by and large, is a disregard of the regulations?
I think, I spoke about the innovative partnerships. Some of the partnerships that we are exploring is public-public partnerships. Municipalities partnering with their communities, because if you think about it, communities are the ones that are there every day. In terms of when someone start putting in their check, because there's also a law that says if the people are settled for over a number of hours or days, you are not allowed to remove them unless you've got alternative land. Some of the land is private land. It's not necessarily municipal land. And when the owners are not able to give the powers to the municipality to enforce any invasion on that land, then it becomes a problem to the neighbors, to the neighboring landowners, which most probably will become municipalities. So it is not a very simple way of dealing with it. It needs all sectors, the private sector, to come into partnership with local government. Because I think a lot of these things can be resolved. Because if you think about communities that are resettling on rail, next to the railroads, their land there doesn't necessarily belong to the municipality. But if the landowner is able to partner with the municipality and give the municipality the powers to be able to safeguard and to enforce and to make sure that there is no invasion, or as soon as they see invasion, that police are able to be sent to make sure that the people are removed, then we can be able to deal with some of the issues. And I think because traditionally there's been just a one-sided way of partnering. The other partnerships is with communities that can adopt their public spaces, adopt their communities to be able to partner with the municipality, and doesn't require an exchange of funding. So it's a simple kind of partnership that says to the community, we would like to partner with you to be able to do A, B, C, D, and to become our eyes when we think about the waste that end up clogging our stormwater drainage is because people are littering waste everywhere. And if there's a partnership between communities and municipality where communities are being incentivized to be able to raise the alarm when someone is dumping the waste, meaning there is some kind of a reward, that you are able to start to see the change, because by the time a municipal worker arrive on the scene, then you have a mountain of a problem.
Johan, where do you as the sector fit into this conversation that includes public-private partnerships? And often I become very reluctant when I hear the word, multi-sectoral approach, because often what that means is that there's a lot of people in the room saying a lot of things, but at the end of the day, nobody wants to take actual accountability and responsibility for the kind of progress that is needed on an issue, because it's a shared responsibility, So Johan, as the insurance sector, where do you see yourselves in this conversation, and as a potential partner, what is the role that you believe in organizations like yourselves can be playing?
Thanks, and I think it's important. So insurance industry really helps to fast track the speed at which recovery can take place. So I think on our side, making sure that we provide cover, and quite often the education element is because there are ways that communities can engage in risk improvement measures, which doesn't necessarily cost money. So it is through that educational role, but then also making sure that we can react quickly and as quickly as possible. So after an event, the most important thing is actually to return the economic contributing community back to their jobs as quickly as possible. And I think just getting businesses back on track, making sure that we're able to secure or safeguard job losses is the biggest role that we play.
Is there a checklist, Johan, that we as individuals or even businesses need to be mindful of when it comes to the kind of insurance cover that they have, and making sure that that is updated to keep up with, again, what is a changing climate?
So one of the most important aspects is to engage with your insurance service provider. So the insurers invest in advanced models that enable them to better understand risks, and it's through the advice that they can provide to customers to help engage and implement strategies to reduce their risk exposure.
All right. Let me move this conversation then to the floor and get some questions from our audience that is in the auditorium. I see we do have 2 roving mics. If you can just maybe by way of, we've got 1 mic, apologies, by way of just raising your hand. And as I said, you can introduce yourself and let me know who you want to answer your question.
Perfect. Good morning, all. This is Pokazi Putini. I come from Standard Bank Group, and my question is for Johan. And thank you to the panel at Wide for the insights. I mean, it's pretty clear that climate change poses quite a risk to not only us as a, as a society, but also in the insurance industry specifically. So, Johan, for me, I'm trying to think of, where the bright spark is. I'm trying to be half glass full optimistic. So perhaps my question to you is, where are the opportunities for the insurance industry in dealing with our clients? Perhaps do we want to design product better, or maybe there's a client engagement strategy that we want to employ going forward that will see a positive change, specifically for the industry? Thanks.
So one of the most important aspects is ongoing product innovation, and there are several metrics that can help in the product side. So the traditional products is you get a solution and you have to take the full bucket in order to get protection. But the most important is to provide the most elementary cover possible, so to provide access to everybody. So one of our focuses specifically is how we can modularize product design. So to provide that customization, so not the one-size-fits-all solution to everybody. And we've embarked on a great journey to do that, so that when we engage clients, we can look at the specific needs of the client and then design a solution that can address at the heart the most important aspects, so especially in businesses. So what is the biggest risk that a business faces, and how we can make sure that we provide that cover.
Does that also include, Johan, and I know that this is often a bit of a hot potato, because there is a segment of our population that often is described as the unbankables, right? People who find it difficult to open bank accounts and have access to the traditional sort of system. Those are the same people who, when it comes to insurance, it's a product that is also highly inaccessible for them. Is the kind of challenge that we're facing with climate change such that institutions like yourself also need to develop or think of developing products that reaches those constituencies and those markets too?
Yeah. So it's obviously the conundrum question, but the importance is that you start, or that we provide solutions to the SME and the small, so to every individual. So if you think of small SME banks, how you can offer the most elementary solution to that business.
Okay. Let me go to more questions from our audience.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Chrissy Dube from Good Governance Africa, and my question is directed to Dora. In terms of municipalities, we have seen, and you've mentioned as well, drainage blockages and other things that cause water damage during, climate change, flooding, and normal rains. Is there any mechanisms in terms of accountabilities being put in place for municipalities to make sure that they are maintaining infrastructure as basic as drainages, as this has been a problem, and it's recurring?
Thank you so much for this question. I think, we have recognized that some of the interventions are really very basic, as basic as just cleaning out your drainage system. So yes, there are programs, and there is a support that we run. So every time, you know, we see a forecast of a heavy rain or a flooding, as SALGA, we sent out a note to all our municipalities in that area to remind them to, you know, to clean up the, you know, the drainages. You know, it sounds like something that is mundane, but it's very important that if you know that there is going to be a huge storm coming your way, that you are able to clean out the drainage, that you are able to stock up on the sandbags to create, you know, barriers to protect some of the infrastructure and to make sure that you know, you are able to run. But one of the things that I want to point out is that the amount of the rainfall in many cases is not being able to, you know, the infrastructure, the drainages are not equipped to be able to handle the amount of the rainfall that is coming right now with the heavy rains that municipalities are facing. So that is just the one element. So besides the efforts to clear out the drainages, they found that the intensity of the rain is such that the systems that are already in place are not able to cope.
Andries, if we have to think about innovation in the space, and I hear Dora talking about, you know, the fact that the systems that they have, the communication that they have, but we all know what is happening in our municipalities. So in as much as you know, SALGA will be able to say, yes, you know, we sent out notes and told the municipalities to clean out the stormwater drains, it's not happening. And so when then we have to think about innovative solutions with what we have now, where would some of those need to look into? Because the reality is that as things stand, it's going to take years to change the infrastructure that we have. But the floods are not going to stop because we're still working on a plan, or we're still waiting for universities to produce a certain level of town planners that are going to bring the kind of solution that we need.
That is a very difficult question. Because I'm not sure what local government will be able to do, you know, with old infrastructure and old drainage systems and so on. I think that is a question that only an engineer can effectively answer, because it will require to adjust or improve on what is already there. Because to actually replace it according to new standards and so on, you know, it is financially, you know, it's impossible to do, you know. So I'm not sure what steps can be taken, you know, in the meantime, you know, to actually alleviate that. But what I can also say in that regard is that the standards that are currently in use they have been developed many, many years ago. And it's high time that those standards are actually updated with new rainfall and drainage data and so forth. And so that all new developments that's taking place, you know, can be designed according to new standards.
I think that will be possibly an important one that can bring about change sooner. All right, let me take more questions from the floor.
Good morning. My name is Calvin from Standard Bank Insurance. I have a question for Dora and Andries. We see a lot of an impact on pollution and climate change as a result of livestock farming because of methane gas emissions. Do you guys see, you know, any solution that we could identify for South Africa?
Okay, I'll try to give perspective on the methane story. The biggest problem that we have regarding methane is, I suppose you all know about the Paris Agreement that wants to sort of limit global warming to a level of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And during the past year, 2 months it actually, you know, breached that threshold. And one of the consequences of that is that if you look globally, the one region in the world that is warming the fastest is the northern latitudes, like Siberia and those places. And it's got a lot of, the surface is basically, a lot of it is covered by permafrost, which traps or stores vast amounts of methane. And if we are on our way to breach that 1.5 degrees Celsius, I think that it is going to be breached over the medium term, actually. And the methane that is produced by agriculture will actually be dwarfed by that amount of methane that will be released by the thawing of the permafrost in the northern latitudes. So I think that is something more to worry about, is to curb that increase, to try and mitigate climate change in that way, instead of, obviously agriculture is also important, but it is, in scale, it is not comparable to what is happening in the Northern Hemisphere.
Dora?
Yeah, I think just to support Doctor, is that I think the amount of methane generated by agriculture at this stage, in terms of our contribution towards the global, towards the greenhouse gas emission, I think it probably might be minuscule. I think the doc has just said that. And I think we need to look at, if you're talking about pollution, what kind of pollution are we talking about? I think our biggest contributor to the greenhouse gas emissions is probably energy production. And I think that's where we need to look at. And I think then you've got transport that follows, which is why we've been lobbying for rail, that a lot of goods be moved from the road to the rail. So there is a cascading of the contributions that are made by the various sectors. And I think livestock farming at this stage is probably a little bit lower. And I think we are just worried about dealing with the fossil fuels contributions towards the greenhouse gas emissions.
All right. Thanks for that. Let me take more questions from the floor. Yes, sir.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mitchell Black. I am the head of Policy and Research Alignment from Rise Mzansi in Gauteng. We need to refer to this as a crisis. First and foremost, language matters. And I'm sure that my learned colleagues on the panel will agree that we are outstripping all available models. The permafrost that you indicated is one of several tipping points that we have not included in the climate models that say the Paris Agreement was based on. We are going to and are blowing past all of our current measurements. It is important that we realize this. Second, we have to realize that the vast majority of South Africans live in a state defined by precarity. Even the insured are one extreme weather event away from poverty, away from destitution. Moreover, where we have households that are built, not generational wealth in the bank, but generational wealth in terms of a couch was bought by an uncle, a bed was bought by a grandmother. We are assembling homes and homesteads over generations. This is the challenge that we are facing. But more so, we need to acknowledge that this is a systemic issue across the board. We mentioned methane in agriculture. In agriculture alone, methane is not the biggest problem. We are talking about the entire value chain that supports current agriculture. My question is now. So there's not much that the everyday individuals can do besides putting pressure on their service providers to make smart climate choices. And the question that I want to ask to the panel, whoever wants to take it, is what can the insurance industry do to place pressure on the drivers and the actors behind the climate crisis, right? What can you do to help turn the ship?
All right. Thanks for that question. I'll give it to you, Johan, because I think it's more in your line of work. Before I do, Andries, is it a crisis, as he's saying? Are we using the wrong language for it?
Yes, I tend to agree with what his sentiments, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Johan?
So no doubt the cost of insurance continues to increase. And the only way that it impacts the consumer is through rising premiums. So the pressure really comes to act decisively. So if a business or individual is not interested in adopting measures that can help them reduce the risk exposure, it ultimately culminates in them experiencing the financial consequence thereof. So the pressure from the industry is kind of two ways. On the one side, for those consumers are not interested or not embracing the real measures, because as insurer, you can educate, you can provide advice, but it's through the partnership to say, here are the measures that you need to take to help reduce the implications of the losses. So my simple response would be one of partnership and one through education, because that drives, ultimately, by not embracing it, it leads to that increase in premium and ultimate uninsurability. So the consequences is far more dire if no action is taken.
Part of what I also understood him to be asking is, do you as a sector see a role for yourselves in putting pressure on the municipalities that Doro was speaking about? Because if the stormwater drain is not cleaned up and we have a flash flood, my car then gets caught up in that drama. The next person I'm calling is you, Johan. So are you going to, or do you at any point have a conversation with Dora to say, but Dora, you know, you're creating more problems for me this side. Please try and clean your stormwater drains.
I think those conversations are ongoing, but needless to say, I think we must acknowledge that a lot more can be done. The speed and the ability to action and to enable local government is also dependent on financial resources. So as much as we point one finger or a finger in one direction, it's a societal issue that we all need to work together and see how best we can alleviate the pressure.
All right, so in a moment then we'll be concluding our conversation looking at the impact of climate change and how it is affecting the insurance industry, but also how it is affecting society. We'll continue with that in a moment. It is now time for your latest news update. It's 11 o'clock. It's 5 after 11 o'clock. We continue the conversation on the talking point. Welcome to the third and final hour of the show. In a moment, of course, we're going to be focusing on government's land reform program and looking at some of the challenges that it has been facing. But before we get to that, we're going to conclude our conversation, part of our special broadcast with Standard Bank Insurance and the Mail and Guardian's Thought Leadership Dialogue series. We are live at the Leonardo Hotel in Sandton. We've been looking at the impact of climate change, how it affects us, how it affects our cities, and how it affects the insurance that, of course, is so important when it comes to helping rebuild after we have experienced adverse climate events. So I'm going to give my panelists an opportunity to perhaps give me their closing remarks, but before I do that, I'm going to squeeze in one last question from our audience. So yes, sir, if you can just then go ahead and introduce yourself and ask your question.
Okay, good morning. My name is Gorat Khitsani. I'm an independent public sector consultant. I had one of the audience mentioned global, and I said, okay, how can we talk about climate change and not address resilient cities? Taking the concept of smart cities, building an integrated city, Dora regards resilience. How ready are we in terms of building resilient cities within the South African context? I mean, addressing even, we can go global and talk about Netherlands, Rotterdam. They've got innovative approaches in terms of building strategies regarding resilient cities. Your comment on that, Dora? Thank you very much.
Yes, no, I think I can safely say that cities in South Africa are actually a little bit step ahead of the rest of the local government or the rest of municipalities. A lot of them are being assisted by various institutions, including C40 Cities, ITLE, UK Pact, to develop or to put together climate action plans. The City of Johannesburg, City of Cape Town, and there are various interventions that are included in there, and it is all about building resiliency within the cities. But again, broadly within municipalities, because if you address issues at a city level and you don't address the issues at the neighboring municipality, unfortunately, climate change knows no bounds, just like it knows no bounds between countries and regions. So we are looking at it in an integrated manner in terms of looking at regions. Like, for example, you've got the Gauteng city region, where cities, the three metros would work with some of the districts in Gauteng to be able to work on some of the initiatives to build resiliency. So there is a serious program. Cities have got what is called the climate action plans. In fact, they are far ahead because the climate change bill is yet to be passed by Parliament. That is going to become mandatory for all of local government or for districts and metros to produce climate action plans.
Johan, the one thing we can't run away from is the cost of the impact of climate change. And I wonder, from a sustainability point of view, what that risk then presents for the insurance industry.
Thank you for that question, and it's very real, and we've experienced significant impacts in the last 3 years. And the commitment from the sector is how we change the way that we underwrite and look at insurance, and particularly some of the efforts that we've invested in is the geocoding of risks to better understand the risks that individual properties face, and then how we can act differently in partnership with our clients. So we have to change the way, and we are on an active strategy to execute on that.
All right, so as we get ready to conclude this conversation then, I'm going to start it off with you, Andries, to give us your closing comments. And maybe if you can just weave into that, what are the questions that you believe we as residents of these cities, of these towns, can and need to be asking, whether it's ourselves or asking our local communities, our local government, to ensure that there are, in fact, steps that either we are taking or that government is taking to build resilience into our system and into our infrastructure?
Okay, as far as I'm aware, every district municipality's got to have a climate change response plan. And we have assisted with that on several occasions, and we have been in dialogue with that many times, you know, for them to assist them with information to develop that. And it is up to the community to ensure that they have knowledge about that climate change response plans, and this hold the local government to account, you know, to actually apply those measures that they say they are going to apply. But okay, for the conversation as a whole, I will conclude, you know, that this is basically about disaster risk and what climate change poses to it. And these risks are sort of unique to every sector, a climate relevant sector. And a climate relevant sector is every sector that is exposed to climate change and variability. And the threats that climate change can pose to every of those sectors are actually unique. So from the Weather Service side, we have done several projects with large companies, whether it is agricultural or mining and so on, where they have expressed what are their risks, what are their thresholds, you know, that will be sort of hazardous to them, you know, if it gets surpassed, and what are the chances of that happening. And so we would like to expand on that, you know, because that helps to adapt to climate change. And I think, you know, with the insurance industry, you know, we can sort of work together holistically on that problem.
All right. Thanks for that, Andries. Dora?
Look, climate change is a real crisis. And municipalities, both small and metros, are actually in the front line of fighting this crisis. A disaster happens at a local level. All of us live in a municipality. And I think it's important for us to recognize that municipalities are not able to shoulder the huge investments that are required to build a climate resilient society that we really must be building right now. And I think my call to the insurance industry is that our door is open to facilitate partnerships with municipalities to be able to determine the vulnerabilities that exist within those communities and start putting together plans, that are not going to be just plans, but plans that are going to be resourced to be able to reduce the risk of destruction of critical infrastructure and loss of life. It is an all of society work that needs to happen, because if you pull back and you watch and you say there are these problems with local government, unfortunately your house, your road is going to be impacted.
All right. Thanks for that, Dora. Johan, you'll have the final word on this one.
Good. And I couldn't agree more than with what Dora has just said. So the most important thing is climate change is real. Each and every one of us in this room and in the audience would have experienced some sort of impact from climate change. And the only real way to impact that is to consider your own environment and the own community where you live in, and really take at heart all the actions and every step, doesn't matter how small it is, to see how you can avert being impacted or to reduce the severity to which you can be impacted. So there's no sooner time to act than doing it immediately. And I think through the partnerships, we can help with the education and insurance. For it to be long-term sustainable, we've got to continuously find measures to help reduce the impact. But no doubt, insurance then contributes significantly to the overall economic growth. We're certainly not the only player, but it's a very meaningful contributor, and we're proud to play that role.
Thank you so much for that, Johan. I certainly think that one of the big takeaways, at least for me, is that we all need to be better educating ourselves, better informing ourselves about the environments in which we are living in and the environments in which we work in, the industries in which we work in, and how those are likely to be impacted by climate change going forward. Because it's only through that education that we can come up with solutions to mitigate against what the future might have in store, because that is really what we can only predict, but nobody really knows what the full extent of this changing climate is going to be. So let me thank you all for coming onto the show today, for sharing your insights. Guests, of course, being Johan van Geuning. He's the CEO of Standard Bank Insurance Limited. It's the short-term insurance arm of the Standard Bank Group. Dora Marema, Portfolio Head, Municipal Sustainability at the South African Local Government Association, and Dr. Andries Kruger, who's a Chief Scientist at the South African Weather Service. On that note, that's where we're going to leave it with our special broadcast for today in partnership with Standard Bank Insurance and the Mail and Guardian. I'm sure it will not be the last of the sessions that we have. We will continue with the talking point in a moment. We'll be focusing on government and the land reform program, and just taking a look at some of the challenges that those that have been trying to access land, what they have been experiencing. So do stay tuned in for that conversation that's coming up after this quick break. Testing 1, 2. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. You've been absolutely brilliant in the first half of this conversation. That's not where we leave it, however. We're going to move on to the second half of the conversation. That's going to be facilitated by my colleague, Oliver Dixon. Let's give our panelists a big round of applause, please. They've been absolutely fantastic. And thank you, too, for your engagement in the first half. I hope that you're going to be equally engaged as we continue. Thank you so much.
Can we get this on? Oh, this is on. Great. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second session of this fantastic and important insurance dialogue. My name is Oliver Dixon. I am a radio broadcaster at SAFM. As Kathy said, I am one of her colleagues. And we're going to be continuing this conversation. And I want to introduce my panelists for you this morning. Very, very esteemed panel this morning. We're joined by a personal favorite of mine, Professor Jennifer Fitchett, who is a professor of physical geography at Wits. Prof, thank you so much for really do appreciate it. We're also joined by Dr. Hardy Ncube, who's the head of personal products and at Standard Insurance Limited. Lovely. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it, Dr. Hardy. Dini Nondumu, who's the head of commercial insurance at Standard Insurance Limited, is on the very end of the stage, and he's also joining us, as well as Shaka Zwane, who's the head of insurance and fiduciary, focusing on client coverage, insurance and fiduciary at Standard Insurance Limited. Thank you so much for joining us. Really do appreciate it. I want to start this conversation with a little bit of a personal anecdote, one that I think is important and instructive to the conversation. I grew up in a small little town called Randfontein. Many people don't know where that is. So for context, it's just after Krugersdorp where all the devilish things were happening, right? It wasn't in Randfontein. I promise you, we were good. But I grew up in Randfontein, small little town. Specifically, I grew up in a township called Toekomsrus. My family, my grandfather, started a small little bakery in Tukomzero. So anybody who's from Randfontein will know exactly what I'm talking about. You'll know us as the business that was taken out of business by Butterfield and those guys, right? And my granddad, geriatrically ran the thing and became old and realized he was old, and my dad took it over and managed the business. And it was a fantastic business. It took many of us in the family to school, and it's a classic small township business. The business grew. We started delivering bread to neighboring townships, Muhlakeng, Senzele, Simunye, up until western area if you're going further west, if you're coming back this way, Kagiso, and neighboring townships. And it really, really grew. We started getting these really big industrial bakery ovens that could bake up to 100 loaves at a time. And at some point, there were mechanical breakdowns in the machinery, in the actual ovens. And to add insult to injury, the roof was leaking at some point. There were heavy rains pouring down, and it seeped into the electrical works of the bakery and specifically the ovens, industrial ovens, and it broke down. We couldn't afford to fix it. The parts were expensive to replace. In fact, many of the parts weren't locally available, and the business was in limbo, running at a loss to the point where the business shut down ultimately. It was not an insured business. And this morning, thinking about the conversation, I thought about what my life would have turned out like had the business not shut down, where the business would be like, and what my family would have been like from a wealth and material point of view. And this story, albeit happening many, many years ago, is the story of 82% of businesses that fell victim to the floods in KZN in April 2022. That is quite literally 8 in every 10 businesses in KZN in April 2022 were not insured. Many of them had to shut down and are struggling to get back up on their feet. The cost of that to the economy was 65 billion rand. The cost of insurance, the cost of not being insured, or at least the economical loss of that at a continental-wide scale is 1.18 trillion rand across the continent. Just last year alone, in November, the insurance industry saw 35 million rand in claims due to a hailstorm. And this past weekend, the golf course I belong to, they're going to be putting in a claim because there was serious damage that happened to the course as a result of the heavy rains that happened this weekend. And so this conversation is about South Africans like myself and my family, South Africans like the people and business owners, family business owners in KZN. And so I want to start here. Jen, I want to start with you. Because this conversation ultimately is about how vulnerable am I as an insurance consumer and how can I best be protected? So before we get there, we have to understand the vulnerability and the scale of it. Do we have enough meteorological data that can help us inform the choices we make about what we buy, when we buy it, where we buy it, and perhaps to give us an understanding of the damage that could come from inclement weather?
I think it's a very good question, and part of the question is, what is enough? We've got a really good network of meteorological stations across South Africa. You heard from Dr. Andries Kruger earlier this morning. We have over 200 South African Weather Service stations. We've got another large network of stations through the Agricultural Research Council. We've got some of the best climate modelers in Africa who are based here in South Africa and producing regional climate models that are tailored for South Africa. And so we have some of the best information possible on the African continent to be able to forecast on short-term scales and project on long-term scales the type of climate extremes that we face. The problem, however, is that climate extremes are very unpredictable by their nature, and under climate change, these are becoming more and more unpredictable. So we're seeing greater variability. So part of the reason for that is because the extreme events themselves are starting to change. The Durban floods is an excellent example. That particular event is typically characterized as a cut-off low event. So those are responsible for a large amount of rainfall across the Durban region, but also much of South Africa. However, if you drill down to that specific climatology, it's a very unusual event because it starts to represent the type of pattern we'd see in a tropical cyclone. And if we're starting to see new storm types that have never been recorded before, never been observed before, it becomes very difficult to be able to predict when those will happen. So our storm nature is changing, our climatology is changing as climate change is starting to intensify. So it's not only about saying, is an event going to happen more often? Is it going to be greater in intensity? But what are the events themselves and how are those changing in their dynamics?
So what data do we then need to collect to fill that information vacuum?
So part of it is about collecting data as and when things are happening, and we're doing that. Part of it is very new forms of science. The Global Change Institute, for example, is looking at attribution science and how we're able to model these types of events and to detract whether or not they would happen under a pre-industrial climate or before the effects of our increased greenhouse gases. But we also need to be increasing our monitoring networks as best as possible so that we are able to pick up events and to be able to run the kinds of analyses as quickly as possible.
Shaka, I want to ask you this. When Jen and her really smart colleagues built these models that tell you things, but they also tell you we don't know enough and we don't know what we don't know, what do you and your other smart insurance colleagues do? How do you say to your actuary team, hey guys, this is the data we have. These people tell us that we don't know enough and we don't know what we don't know. What do you do with that sort of meteorological data?
That's a difficult question because I don't deal much with actuaries, but I will try and attempt to answer that, and then I'll hand over to Dr. Harding Ncube, who actually deals with actuaries on a more regular basis. But I think what is critical, the point that the Prof has raised here next to me, is that it's important to observe patterns. Things don't just happen. So the natural disasters, particularly the floods, which is the focus of the topic today, don't just happen in isolation. These things do get predicted, even though at times, it's very difficult to predict, particularly the quantum, the extent, etc. But what is important is to establish the pattern and understand, what is most likely to befall us. And insurers largely work on, looking at the patterns historically, and then, of course, price for the risk in future. And that really is what informs pricing as it relates to actuaries. But as I say, my
Dr. Ncube, does it become difficult to price for risk when you don't know enough and you don't know what you don't know about future weather events for insurance as an industry-wide? I don't know what the rest of the world is doing, but in South Africa, how are we faring?
Yeah, it definitely does become a bit of a challenge, but because if you don't know what you don't know, you have got to make use of what you know. From the experiences that we've seen in the past and that is coming through as newer types of losses, newer types of storm, these are things that are brought into actuarial models to calibrate and project on the basis of experience. And as and when we learn, as we go along and learn on what is happening on the ground, then we bring those new nuances into recalibrating these models in projecting into the future what the outcome possibly could.
Yeah, can we get Dr. Hardy's mic a little bit fixed? It seems to be cutting intermittently. I would love for everybody to hear him loud and clear all the way into the back. While we get that sorted, perhaps to ask you then this. You told us that we need to look to the past, to look for patterns, and that will help us see what comes in the future. Dini, I want to ask you this. When we look at contemporary history, what has been some of the most catastrophic storm-related or flood-related events based on what you've been seeing coming through in big claims?
So I think one which has been expressed quite extensively this morning is the KZN floods, which took place here in South Africa. But we don't exist in an island. These events catastrophic flood events are happening all around the world. I think Italy experienced $2.7 billion worth of damage and losses in their floods in 2021. Then we also have some flood events which took place in the US, another $3.7 billion worth of damage that took place there. So I think to pick up on Dr. Hardy's point, in terms of looking to the past, in terms of the data that we have, actuarial data and modeling, and historical climatological events and patterns that took place, what used to be referred to as a 1 in 100 year event is now becoming more of a 1 in 50 or 1 in 20 year event, KZN floods included. I mean, some of the damage and the rain and the patterns that took place in the floods in 2022, these were seen in 1973, same floods. These were seen in 1984, same floods going through the same region. So that data that we've gathered there assists us from an insurance industry point of view to better price and model what may happen in future. And I think that's the role of the very smart actuaries within the insurance industry, to be able to price better, because as insurers, we're also very reliant on the reinsurance market. Now, the reinsurance market is a global market. So what they will do is they will take their pricing models based on what happened in Italy, based on what happened in Mexico, based on what happens in Australia, put them into their models, and when they price for South Africa, they do factor that in. And that's kind of the cross or global cross-subsidization of pricing that we will experience as insurers as we approach the reinsurance markets looking for supports to be able to better insure within the South African region.
In the previous panel, there was a little bit of a dialectic between Dora and Johan about responsiveness and reactionary behavior when it comes to climate disasters and the management thereof. If we were better prepared for climate management and therefore for disaster response, would we be able to mitigate the cost of the impact significantly?
We would definitely be able to reduce the impact. I think previous panelist, Johan, did mention it, that it's not just financial that can actually prepare businesses, society, individuals from some of these incidents. Being proactive from a town planning point of view, I think the professor in the previous panel did mention that some of the methodologies that they use now, they need to update those in order to be able to better the storm drainage that Dora was referring to. If you have better technology, more innovative technology being put in place, that is another mitigant that will protect and reduce the impact of these incidents in future.
Yeah. Jen, there are people watching this live on the SFM radio platforms and the Mail and Guardian live stream platforms, and they're thinking, my goodness, if I am to buy a house, do I need to find out which city has the best stormwater drain management systems? How do customers and consumers start making decisions about their lives in relation to the data and information we have about potential disaster?
Yeah, so there's a lot of work that's being done in terms of developing livability indices that would be able to tell you relative risk of one area versus another. But what's important to recognize is that climate change impacts and extreme climate events are diverse, and South Africa has a large suite of those. We've got tornadoes, we've got the secondary impacts from tropical cyclones that make landfall in Beira, we've got the cut-off flow systems that result in the floods in KwaZulu-Natal, we've got the day zero drought in Cape Town that's occurred. And so, although coastal regions are typically more exposed to a greater level of risk and to a greater diversity of risks, we also need to bear in mind that there are no places on Earth that do not experience any type of extreme climate. And so part of it is about not finding that perfect location to live, but in trying to understand and to mitigate your risk for the specific types of events that are likely in your region, and to understand how those vary through time and vary through space.
Yeah. Dr. Ncube, to that, and I think this is really important to have a sense of, which insurance category has been most vulnerable from past events? Is it home insurance, car insurance, business insurance? What insurance category carries the highest vulnerability and risk?
So I'd say general across the board, we've seen, like you really spoke about, businesses getting out, businesses being affected and getting out of business because they are uninsured. But the predominant area in which this flooding is impacted is mostly within the whole household space, where homes are destroyed, contents of homes are destroyed, also to the extent that, to a certain extent, you find that vehicles are also destroyed or affected in flooding, whether be it hail damage that is experienced in that regard. So I would say the household space is the most affected in this regard.
So homes can do a little bit better. What then do homeowners need to know? Is it about protecting the physical home? Is it about protecting what's inside of the home? Shaka, how do you speak to a homeowner about their insurance journey?
That's a very, very important question, Oliver. Because, as insurers, and you'd often, hear people say, oh, insurers don't want to pay. It's quite important that households and owners of homes understand what is covered by their insurers and what responsibility lies with them. I'll give you a couple of examples. If you have a house or a home and you don't do certain maintenance things on a regular basis, and obviously then there's an issue with the house as a result of that. Naturally, because there was no insurable peril, what we call an insurable peril, which means there was no particular event that led into that damage, we would probably more often than not say, you have to fix that yourself. We're not going to pay for that claim. So I think the message I'd like to get across to all owners of particularly homeowners is to say, maintain what you need to maintain regularly. And of course, there will always be those disasters that are once off that occur that we would then come in and insure. But you have to play your part.
Let's make this a little bit more realistic, right?
Yeah.
There is a 29-year-old professional who had just gotten a promotion into senior management, and in true millennial style, they can finally afford their first home, but they just heard that, the interest rate is not doing too well. We're in a hyperinflationary environment, and now you're paying, what, 12%, nearly 11.75, I think, on the interest on a bond. You think, wow, that's really, really expensive, but I need to get a home. My family needs to live somewhere, and I have always told them that I'm going to move them into really nice suburbia with the most beautiful jacaranda trees. And they think, okay, this is expensive. Gardening service is expensive. Okay, we've got a pool, so now we have to fix that. Okay, I need to pay levies, and those are going up because, the city of Johannesburg wants their money too. I can't afford insurance. I can't afford home insurance. And we must be honest, it's expensive. But the cost of not having it is a lot more expensive. But how do you psychologically compute that when you have to make that decision?
It's actually, if you think of, in fact, if I can very briefly put it this way, if you think of buying any asset, you actually have to think about how am I going to protect this asset? Because at the end of the day, that's exactly what insurance exists for, is to actually shift the risk from yourself to the insurer so that in the event that something happens, you actually are insured.
How do I know if the asset matters enough for me to protect it?
Well, I would think that it mattered enough for you to actually have it in the first place. And therefore, if you have it, it actually matters that you protect
it. I think that's a beautiful answer. Mail and Guardian, you have to run that on your social media sites all day long. That is the real promo there. Perhaps to this then. How is the industry, Dini, coming together to manage risk and affordability? To say, look, there is higher risk, but we need to make sure that the access to insurance is affordable, right? How is, and I don't know what the rest of the world is doing, but what's the conversation in South Africa?
I think the key word to that is education. And that is educating the consumer, be it an individual or a business in itself. I think the notion that insurance is extremely expensive, I would dare say, is subjective at best. And why I say that is insurance cover protecting your assets. There isn't a linear way or a single way to do it. And this is where the advisory piece comes in. As an individual, as a business, it is extremely important to speak to and consult your financial services provider, your broker, and have them advise you, because there are many ways in which you can actually rationalize your insurance cover, either as a business and taking up certain covers that are required to protect what's more important in terms of that business and the operations continuing in the event of a disaster. Likewise, for an individual and for their home or their vehicle, etc. But you need professional advice, and that is where, as an industry, we don't only have the side of the insurer, we have the side of the broker, and they work together to make sure that the best possible advice and ultimately the best solution for the individual or the business is what's presented to the client, and the client can make that decision And some of those levers, once you make those decisions, also become levers where, from a financial affordability point of view, you can utilize them. So Shaka's very famous statement, which you're going to run on Mail and Guardian.
Tweet it, hashtag it real quick, whatever the hashtag may be.
How important is your asset?
How important, hashtag how important is your asset? Mail and Guardian, let's go with that. The SAFM digital team, I'll tell them, they're right outside, I'll tell them right after that. Dr. Ncube, to ask then this, is the industry adaptive to the changes? Are we building better products that are consumer-centered, industry-wide?
Yeah, I think the industry is becoming more adaptive. Earlier, Johan talked about the modular approach to insurance design and solutioning, which in simpler terms basically speaks to what my colleague Dini was talking about, that creating solutions that you can break into packages and pieces that suits the particular client's need. In that way, the client can also choose what is most pertinent in terms of the insurance that they need. These are solutions that are becoming much more common within the insurance industry. And for our part, especially from a Standard Bank insurance perspective, that's the journey that we have embarked on with a view to make insurance affordability. We don't believe that insurance is expensive, but I think to make it much more affordable by structuring solutions that customers can actually package for themselves and avoid leaving a gap that we talked about. The 82% is quite a worrying gap for both businesses and for both individuals. So it's quite pertinent that we strive towards that direction in making sure that we can create solutions that help cover this protection gap that is a big concern.
Yeah, we're going to open the floor for questions and engagements in a very short while, so please do start preparing those and raise your hand. A mic will miraculously come to you. I promise you they'll see you. Shaka, since, if we look at the last maybe 5 years of really catastrophic events, weather events in South Africa as a result of climate change and the impact thereof, have more South Africans taken up insurance, or has there been a reduction in that, or has it stayed statically flat?
Well, firstly, I just want to point out that there is about a 34 trillion gap in insurance out there in South Africa, which means that there are a lot more South Africans who are underinsured or not insured to the extent that they should be. The industry itself—
Sorry, what's the difference between underinsurance and sufficient insurance versus not being insured?
Okay, so it's underinsurance and basically not being insured at all. So underinsurance means that you are insured, but not to the scale and the extent that you should be, given the assets that you've got. Not being insured simply means that you've
Again,
got assets
that's not very clear to me. How do you determine what that scale is, and how do you know if you at that threshold?
So I mean, it's very simple. It's not black and white, but it's really about what assets do I have, and what of those assets are insured and which are not insured. Okay. So.
Sorry, so it's, okay, so that makes sense. It's about having all the assets that matter to you insured, not that you are undervaluing what the asset is and not paying enough insurance on the asset.
Absolutely. That as well is important, because you could have an asset.
Is that also under insurance?
That's under insurance, because you could have an asset which is worth, for example, 500,000, but your insurance only is up to 250,000, for instance.
Yeah, I'm so sorry if these questions are rudimentary. I'm also learning here about insurance. I might have to speak to some people after this about some insurance products here. To this, perhaps, and I want to then ask this, because I think the best possible way to mitigate against climatic weather, a catastrophic weather event, is to slow down the impact of climate change as best as we possibly can, right? And what does that mean and look like, and how do we all come together to make that happen?
Yeah. So climate change mitigation becomes very important then, trying to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. There are annually revised targets through the COP meetings that global players are agreeing to, and then there's a lot of
the last
monitoring.
COP meeting wasn't that great.
Yeah. So there's a lot of monitoring then about what takes place. Here at a local scale, we have the challenge that we are still trying to develop our economies. We're trying to meet the basic needs of our population, but we're also trying to do that in a way where we can try and move towards sustainability targets. Part of that is a major shift towards renewable energy, and for us in South Africa, that has a double benefit of trying to improve our electricity generation capacity, but to do so through renewables such as solar. There have been major increases over the past year in domestic solar uptake, mostly because people are trying to get around load shedding, but because they are moving towards solar, they are reducing the requirement on coal-fired power, so that's important. Right down to an individual level, it's also about thinking about when we're driving. Are we driving in individual cars, or do we have the capacity to carpool? What cars are we driving? What is their level of fuel consumption? Are we leaving lights on unnecessarily in our houses? Those things seem very small, but if every single one of us is making a difference, that multiplies. And I think particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw what individual action can do in terms of having countrywide significant change take place.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Can we open the floor for some questions? By the way, shout out to Standard Bank. I'm going to plug them here. Standard Bank, for every R1 they spent on fossil fuel project investments in the last 2 years, they spent R5 on renewable projects. R1 to every R5. This is an organization that takes serious climate mitigation. So I guess that will reduce the actuarial risk for you, Dr. Ncube? Does it actually reduce the risk? If you guys calculate, okay, we're doing more to mitigate climate, does it then reduce the risk of climate impact over time? Of course, not in the next 5 years, but over the next 50 years, potentially over the next 100 years, do we have models that tell us that there's a reduction in that risk that for me as a consumer means that I don't have to pay more and more and more because we're not collectively doing enough?
Yeah, my comment in that regard is that, of course, each and every business entity globally needs to contribute its little bit to be able to contribute a greater effect on reduction of greenhouse effect. So as Standard Bank, it is also incumbent upon them to make their contribution, whilst it might be negligible in terms of what the overall effect from a greenhouse effect component, but the greater combination or the greater efforts by a number of organizations would definitely lead to reduced greenhouse effect, and of course begin to contribute to the better outcome in terms of climate change. And in that regard, we can begin to see maybe lesser extreme events, as has been talked about, and also as is predicted that the greater the effect on climate continues, the more we're going to see of extreme events that eventually affect everybody else.
Yeah, really, really important. Do we have any questions or any hands up? There's a lovely gentleman here. His name is Gabelo. He'll get a microphone to you. Any questions, engagements, comments, contributions that you'd like to make from the floor? We do welcome that at this stage. No? No hands? You guys are, oh, brilliant. There's a hand. I was about to say, you guys are very confident about your insurance thinking if you don't have any questions.
Not at all. That's where the question comes from. You spoke about household cover, and we touched a bit on business insurance, but what other insurance products can protect me that I don't know about? What are the ones that I don't know about yet? What should I be looking at?
Beautiful, beautiful question. Do you want to go for that, Dr. Ncube?
Yeah, I think we mentioned that purely because we're talking about climate change and the impact of climate change, which is predominantly the damage to the household assets. We have other greater products that we have that may cover the individual from a personal lifestyle perspective, motor insurance, value-added products that we do provide, and we definitely have got much more. But I think the emphasis on our side was that looking into the effect of climate change, the predominant impact of climate change is material damage to the assets that you have, which speaks to your building, your motor vehicle, your household contents, all those we insure.
Yeah. As we wrap up with this question, I want to ask a general question, and I'll give a few of the panelists an opportunity to respond to it, because we just have a minute left. Jen, what matters most to you?
In life or specific to insurance?
In life.
I think for me it's the ability to be able to enjoy life as a millennial in the world that we're currently living in. And what's really important then is to be aware of what we can do right now to be able to ensure that we are living in a world that's still livable in the next 50 years, and a world in which our future generations are able to enjoy the same things that we're enjoying today. And I think over recent years it's become very obvious that that is under threat.
Shaka, what matters most to you?
I think using the knowledge that I have gathered and gained, particularly within the industry and in banking, I happen to be a banker as well, Oliver, but using that knowledge to empower and help people to live better lives.
Dini, what matters most to you?
I think sustainability of livelihood and their insurance impacts. I mean, we're talking about protecting assets, whether it's an individual or a business itself. But to be able to sustain your livelihood for yourself and your loved ones, I think that really matters most. When it's crunch time, your loved ones will trump every and anything every day.
Absolutely. That's where we're going to leave it. Everybody, give a big round of applause to our panel. Really do appreciate it. We ended with 9 seconds to spare, so thank you so much to everybody for being so detailed, but yet being able to, keep it in good time. Do we have any other questions that we want to get around to? Because I did see a hand or two come up. Let's get, Kabelo, which hand is it? This hand right here. I think I saw a hand in, ma'am, right behind the TV there. There was a hand. Yeah, my sister, you that's looking back, right there. We've got you. I saw your hand, or were you just stretching? Oh, okay. Go for it, ma'am.
There's a hand at the back.
Thank you. My name is Nandi from Standard Bank. The question is to Shaka. What's the real cost of these climate-related events? At ground level, what are the big costs that we're looking at?
Sure.
Thank you.
This is a very, very important question. I'm going to try to be as succinct as possible, but there are a lot of costs to climate change. And I think the first and the biggest one is the cost of life. In a study conducted in Munich in 2022, it is said that over 30,000 lives were lost because of the devastating impact of climate change. And the storms and the floods, etc., that comes out of that. So you can understand that's a huge impact. In fact, the same study concludes that 185 million lives were actually impacted by that. So there is a massive impact at a human life level. But I think what is also true is that there is a real disruption into your day-to-day life. I remember during the KZN floods, Oliver, people couldn't cross the road to go to the nearest supermarket to buy the basic essentials. What you found easy to do in Johannesburg, you couldn't do back in Tongaat, back in Durban, in KZN, for instance. So there's a real disruption in human life. People can't get to schools, can't get to community services. They can't have access to hospitals, clinics, churches. There's a real impact in human life.
Jen, is that cost recoverable?
I think there's even bigger than just the immediate costs of an extreme climate event, and human life, I'd say, is never recoverable. When we're talking about the costs of then the disruption to our day-to-day life, I think those are also difficult to recover. A day lost at school is profound for a child who's studying for matric. But we also need to recognize that climate change is also having a more gradual impact on human health. Climate change has an impact on our likelihood of being affected by respiratory disease. Climate change has an impact on mental health, and there's a growing body of research on the link between climate and health. And to be able to recover those kinds of costs when we're not yet able to really quantify the extent of them becomes really difficult to do and becomes far more insidious in our day-to-day life.
Yeah, but we can mitigate, I guess, some of those costs. And we spoke about some of the mitigating examples. In the previous panel, Dora spoke about communities and municipalities, local government institutions having been climate fit and climate ready. Do we have a sense of what that truly should look like, Jen?
I think it's about understanding that it does come into every part of how we operate in our cities, how we operate in our private sectors, and being able to try to move towards, on the one hand, mitigation, and on the other hand, adaptation. Broad scale, making sure that we're better able to withstand storms, tornadoes, hailstorms, but also making sure that we've got evacuation plans so that we're able to protect people as and when events occur.
Yeah. Dini, do you tell a business to be climate ready, disaster ready, and to be disaster resilient? How do you have that conversation?
It goes back to the advisory, the broker, the needs analysis. When a broker arrives at the business, depending on the location of the business, how the proximity to the floodline, the proximity to the ocean, the structural elements of the building itself. Is it built on a ridge? Is it reinforced? If there's an earthquake, not even flooding, is it going to be able to survive? Are the columns going to break up? All of those things form part of the needs analysis, and that's the advisory piece that is critical before or for any business owner, even a homeowner, and why they should then take up the insurance to make sure that they are protected and advised as to what kind of protection they actually specifically need for themselves.
Yeah, and does the stormwater drain system work?
Yeah.
There was a hand up there. Can we get that? And Kabelo, which way is it? Oh, all the way in the back over there. My apologies. Go for it, sir.
Thank you. This is Langelihle Mnyandu from Standard Bank. My observation from, I think, when Johan was speaking and with the current panel was that a clear role for, maybe a more obvious role for insurance, for the insurance industry to play with regards to dealing with these risks and mitigating them is on the education front, so particularly customer education. Johan spoke to that, Dini spoke to that, but I wonder how that would happen, particularly home insurance. We've seen with car insurance, you get SMSs, there's also intense advertising that tells you what to do when you are faced with a risk event or a loss event. But from a home insurance perspective, particularly the structural damage that you may face, I'm not sure whether there's as clear education drive on that front in terms of how do you go with mitigating the risk that you may suffer as a customer. For example, if you look at the landscape of Durban and the catastrophic floods they've been facing, a client may see that maybe their mitigating role would be to fix the structure if there's a crack after heavy rains, but there may be a mudslide or something that affects the lay of the land that the property is in. Is there, would that reporting that to the insurer be something that's considered as a must from a customer perspective that the insurer would consider when they're assessing a claim to say, look, there was a shift 10 meters from the structure of the property and that was not reported. We did not take any mitigatory steps to make sure or assess whether that had an impact on the physical structure of the property, and therefore your claim may be mitigated or well, maybe excluded or limited by that. Is there an education drive to make sure that clients clearly understand those type of mitigatory steps?
That's a beautiful question. That really is beautiful because in a sense, if something happens, and I don't think it's big enough a deal, but its impact down the line may become bigger, are homeowners, business owners, and insurance customers proactive enough, and are insurance businesses proactive enough in getting those addressed? I want to give you an opportunity to go for that, Shaka.
I'll be brief and I'll palm it over to Dr. Hardy, who's more knowledgeable in this area. But I have to say that we do limited communication to our clients and actually to the society at large. But I have to also point out that it's quite difficult to cover everything. But the question is quite pertinent because there are some basic things that we have to communicate to people. For example, Oliver, the fact that you have to maintain your house, and I'll go back to that point. There are things that you've got to do as a homeowner on yourself, on your own, to maintain your house. And there are things where we come in as an insurer. And so we've got to be quite clear around what do we communicate. And I think lastly, it's also up to our clients to make sure that you get as much information as possible when you own a home around what is your responsibility, what should you do annually, what should you do monthly within your house,
How do you go about that without it being an information overload, which can be overwhelming?
And that's exactly the challenge, right? But what also helps is that we do know, for example, when seasons change, we would communicate certain messages that are related to now we're getting into winter. So that does help because you're communicating specific messages. When you get into summer, etc., and we know what would normally go wrong, you'd start communicating those messages. And that's how you can kind of partly manage
Dr. Hardy, do you find it difficult to communicate it to certain insurance customers, some of these really dense messages that, like I said, can feel like an information overload that's overwhelming?
Not necessarily difficult, but I think it's also about trying to maintain the overload at which time you have to communicate particular issues. For example, Shaka talks about reminding customers, let's say it's pre-rainy season, to make sure that they understand what kind of maintenance they need to do, and you advise that kind of information.
Like what sort of stuff? Is your gutter system working?
So it could be your gutter system, checking your gutter system that is cleaned up and making sure that all other maintenance related, like the roof, for example, checking out that the roof is still in a good state, that when the onset of rain, you're not going to have ingress of water into your house that may not necessarily be covered in that regard. So we give this kind of information. But what I want to add in terms of the specific proactive engagement that we're moving into, so we have already procured 2 geolocation analytics software, which will be part of our approach to engaging customers as they come on board, because then we could gauge much more detailed understanding around the locational attributes of where they are located and educate them as they come on board in terms of the flood lines, on whether they are on flood line or not only from a flood line, but geolocational risks that are associated with that. So that gives the client much more information. Also, what we have to do in partnership with the bank is also to give them, especially within the home loans process, where we give them information about why it is necessary to actually insure their property. Because, sometimes the clients may actually feel that the requirements of insurance as part of your home loans agreement is kind of an imposition. But once you communicate them about the need and the potential dangers that lie ahead in the instance that they don't have the asset covered, like we talked earlier about ensuring that which matters to you, because if the asset is lost, you may actually remain with a legal debt to pay in the absence of
This might be an unfair question, but I'll ask you, Han, the question as well during tea. You can't buy a TV in South Africa if you don't have a TV license. It's quite literally a regulatory requirement. Is that the sort of environment you imagine that we need to start thinking about?
In some areas you can. Like in some African countries, for example, you find that certain aspect of motor insurance, you have got a regulatory motor insurance requirement, especially on the liability side. While in South Africa, we've got our form of the road accident fund, which we know the challenges with it. In some geographies, there's certain specific requirements for motor insurance, which is legislated. You can't get your license, you can't get your car registered. And as a result, you find that it's much easier to track from that point, because every vehicle has some form of minimal insurance required, and therefore in tracking what else in terms of the underinsurance levels, that makes life easier to be able to target those customers or communicate with those customers. So to some degree, I think on the motor side, there have to be some sort of minimal regulation. We need to get to a point of even transforming the road accident fund to a more regulated structure that we've seen successfully in like Botswana and Zimbabwe, for example, on the motor insurance.
Yeah. Do you have a view on that, Dini? If you start as business in a specific industry, that it ought to be a regulatory requirement for that to be insured? I don't know if we have such a regime, but is that a conversation that could potentially happen?
Look, currently we don't have the regime, and I mean, to piggyback off Dr. Hardy's point, I think if in the previous conversation it came up, having a triple P solution drive to some of these issues, where between the regulatory bodies, government and the private sector, we put together a solution. On the motor side, I think Dr. Hardy's articulated what some of the regions on our continent are doing in terms of minimum insurance in order to be able to acquire or drive a motor vehicle. Now, I think similarly, we don't have in South Africa, but it is a conversation that has reared its head several times over the last 20 to 25 years, wherein we have SIPs to register a company, okay? And you may not trade unless you have, and depending on which industry, there's certain license requirements to be able to trade. Now, what we could do from a triple P point of view is partner with the insurance industry and the regulatory bodies in terms of registration of businesses, wherein part of the license to trade should include and incorporate some level of insurance for that business. Because it's not just going to be insuring the physical structure of the business itself, but also livelihoods of those employed by the business. Because if the business, in the event of a disaster, is able to, for example, continue to pay salaries of its 10 or 15, especially the SME segment, then you are speaking to sustainability of the population itself to be able to have a livelihood. What does that speak to? It speaks to tax revenue being able to continue to be received from a South African broader landscape point of view. And I think if we have these types of conversations a lot more robustly.
Do we know how to have a continuity conversation?
I believe we do. And there are many examples around the world that we can leverage off. We've got Malaysian examples. We've got American examples in Peru. We can leverage and utilize these specifically for the South African environment. So it's not impossible. Models get replicated all the time. It's just about identifying them, sitting around the table, and then being proactive in terms of, right, how do we engage? How do we action it? How do we pilot it to see what works and what doesn't work for us specifically?
If there was a legislator in the room, in a single line, draw the link between growth and continuity for them.
Tax revenue.
Brilliant. Jen, also a very unfair question, but piggybacking off of what Dinia just said, if businesses were to register, you go to SIPS and you register. Some of the requirements, maybe you must tell us who your auditor is. You might have to get a license to insert an industry. For instance, if you're a manufacturer, you have to get a manufacturing license, whatever the case may be. Do you think, again, very unfair question, but do you think all businesses should also concomitantly present a climate mitigation plan as part of the license requirements to trade?
Yep, I think that would be a really good way to move towards getting all businesses involved in climate change mitigation, but also in understanding climate change. And I think the education component that underpins is really, really important. We have embarked on a plan of training every single first-year student at Wits University on climate change in a Climate Change and Me program. So whether you're a medical student, a lawyer, or someone studying climate, you would have to do a 2-week course on that before you can start any degree. And so if we can do that in the education space, I think we can also do that in the business space.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. We actually have run out of time. We really, really do appreciate it. Can we give a big round of applause to our panelists? Really do appreciate it. Dr. Hardy, Jen, as well as Shaka and Dini. Yeah. There's a message from you over here. Oh, we're taking a picture. Oh. Okay, yeah, you guys remain here. Let me go and have some tea. Thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Thank you all. I was actually not chasing you out of stage, so I just wanted to ensure that the panel remains. We have some token of appreciation for them. But before I go there, my colleague is getting ready. I think my take out of the session today is there's a lot of education that we need to drive. So at individual level, at community level, to try and mitigate the effects of the severe weather patterns as a result of climate change to our industry, to our assets, and also our personal lives, and as you indicated, Prof, even our state of mind, right, our mental health. So with that said, I think the conversation will definitely continue beyond these four walls. We have a role, and we actually do drive that awareness as Standard Bank Insurance, and we will continue to do so, but I also believe that the industry at large is also going to be doing the same. So it's really for us to continue driving the awareness and hopefully have these dialogues and continue with them and not only limit them to this session. With that said, I actually do want to request again that we give the first panel and the second panel a round of applause. It's been a very insightful session. Okay, and then in the interest of time, I will pass the token of appreciation to my colleagues and panel on this side, and then we'll be able to get to the panelists that were with us earlier with your gifts. And then for the rest of the team, so the guests that are in the room, we are going to be moving to the 7th floor where lunch is going to be served, and it is the restaurant that is available to all of us. So when you get there, you can have free seating. There are colleagues who are going to be directing you in terms of like where to go once you get to the 7th floor. Yes, so Joe, there's also a request for pictures for all the panelists just outside the room, right? Yes. Sorry. Okay, yeah, so the two panels, we are requesting pictures. Would you like the pictures on the stage here, or do you want them outside? So on stage here, if you can please hold, and then we'll also just gather everybody. Thank you so much. So Joe, what do we have? Right behind. Let me start on the far left. I don't see Jacob. Please may I ask you, Han and Dora and Dr. Andries Kruger to join us on stage for a picture. Thank you.